So welcome everyone. I hope your day is off to a good start and you're excited to learn about the latest features in Ambari and how it can help you simplify your cluster operations and troubleshoot. My name is Alejandro Fernandez and my colleague, Jayush. Is your mic on?
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're both PMCs for the Apache Ambari project and we both work at Hortonworks. So in case some of you are still new to Ambari, what is it? It's a tool that can monitor, manage, provision the Hadoop services in your stack. And it's completely 100% open source. And so Ambari 2.0 is currently in development right now, and it's stabilizing. And so I want to go over some of the new features in this release and how they can simplify cluster operation. One of the first things that we've added recently is a couple of new services like log search, Zeppelin, and Hive LLAP, which is which is low latency application processing. We've also added role-based access control, and this is because as Ambari grows, we've also had to grow organizations and have Ambari really manage fine-grained controls over its users. In addition, we found that there's a need to make the stacks more extensible and flexible. And so our customers really want to have custom services, they want to have it be part of upgrades, and they want more control over how they can get their releases done. We've also integrated a UI for Ambari metric system, and it's called Grafana. It's a standalone installation that's only for AMS, and it has 15 dashboards to visualize metrics all across your cluster, from HCFS, Yarn, and HBase to a couple of other ones such as Kafka topics. And lastly, we've added a lot of new views, and the ones that are most exciting are Zeppelin and Storm. And so I want to go over the history of how Apache Ambari has progressed over the last couple of months and what we're doing now. And so our release cadence has typically been 2 releases or maybe 3 per year, plus a lot of maintenance releases on top of that. And so in April of 2015, we had Ambari version 2.0 with 1,690 juras. And it's kept increasing ever since. And the current release that we're targeting is Ambari version 2.4. And so far that has over 1,500 juras, and it's still growing. And right now it's at a point where it's very stable, yet we're adding more functionality and thinking about the future and what new trends we want for Ambari. And so the whole point of Ambari is really to manage the entire lifecycle of your cluster. Starting with deployment, the very next thing that customers want to do is secure the cluster, have LDAP sync already configured. And on top of that, one of the major headaches of having a large Hadoop cluster is having to tweak every single config. There's literally thousands of knobs. And so getting this right is very, very difficult, especially because there are so many dependencies. And so Ambari really comes to the rescue with smart configs. It has stack advisors that can actually recommend settings. The very next step is to actually monitor your cluster, receive alerts, and actually be able to track the progress and the health. And so Ambari has a couple of features for that as well. One of the other major tasks of any Hadoop cluster is upgrading it. And this is challenging for several reasons. The first is that it's very time consuming. And secondly, no one person knows the entire stack. And so since Ambari 2.0, we've added features for rolling upgrade. And in the past several months, we've added something called Express Upgrade. And it encapsulates the entire complexity of how to upgrade the stack from HCFS and Yarn to clients. So it's a very, very easy feature to use now. And last, we want to be able to scale your cluster, keep track of how new hosts are going to be added. We want to extend it with custom services and analyze what the performance is like. And so there's other tools to do that as well, and I'll mention Grafana. And so now I will hand it off to my colleague Jayush.
Thanks, Alejandro. So, so far, what we have been supporting is deploying on-premise, and we have done a very good job with deploying on premise. We support different combinations of operating system and database types. you can pick and choose what you want, and based on that we will actually go ahead with the configuration. So the Ambari UI handles all these configurations as well and makes recommendations based on the host specs as such. So that's something which we have been doing really well, but we also have to make sure that things start working on the cloud as well, as we are trying to support both deploying on premise and deploying in the cloud itself. A cloud based deployment comes with its own set of challenges, because you basically want to be really fast, because you are built by the amount of time it takes as such, and you also want to give a very good experience to the user, and that means that you want the hosts to be sysprepped, which means that the installs are the bits are pre-installed and the VMs are created and so on and so forth. And you basically have to have a level of repeatability where you take some sort of a blueprint and you can repeat and redeploy the clusters as such. So we have been working on this, and we have in fact, like based on the changes that we have made to support cloud platforms, we have made Ambari faster as well. So the overall ecosystem has improved just because we have actually started supporting deployments in the cloud itself. So the next part I would actually talk about is, apart from where you deploy, how do we make sure that we make it easy to deploy as such, and that's where the deployment with blueprints comes into picture. It's a systematic way of defining a cluster and deploying a cluster. Essentially it is configs, topology and hosts. You define those, and based on that we will actually deploy the cluster. And it's a very simple way of deploying a cluster, because all you need to do is 2 REST API calls, and I will actually go through that, and you can actually boom deploy a cluster, which makes it really well suitable for repeatability as well, because once you have actually identified that these are the configs I want to set in a test environment, you can take a blueprint and deploy the cluster using the using those the blueprints in multiple environments as such. And let's look at an example here. How do we go about with deploying a cluster with blueprints? As you can see, there are just 2 REST API calls that you have to make. The first one is to create the blueprints and register the blueprint with Ambari, and the second one is actual call to deploy the cluster itself, where you specify what is the blueprint that you want to use and specify the host mapping as such into the blueprint itself. The blueprint itself has 3 sections at a very in a nutshell. It says what are the configs, what is the topology, and what stack version you want to use. So this means that you can actually create a blueprint which is host agnostic and use the same blueprint for multiple deployments as such. And the second call is basically specifying these are my hosts and this is the host mapping that I want to use, and based on that we will actually go about with the deployment. So as you can see, there is a configuration section, there is a host group section which is defines the topology, and the third section is the metadata which specifies that this is the stack version that I want to deploy, and boom, basically here is what we actually specify in the host grouping itself. So although we have been deploying using blueprints, the other challenge is about deploying on a large scale clusters, and there are multiple different requirements. Like you cannot really say that I will deploy a blueprint and then enable all the sophisticated features, like for example carburization, high availability, or stack recommendations, or change configurations later on, because if the cluster is really large, like it's just going to add to the time to deploy the cluster itself, which means that the blueprint itself needs to support Kerberos. You should be able to deploy a secure cluster from the get-go as such, and also you should be able to instead of like deploying the cluster and then enabling high availability, you can actually deploy an HA cluster itself. So all these features have been added in the latest releases, in the last couple of releases, and we are continuously making improvements in this area. Another key challenge here is about host discovery. Like if you actually go to a cloud-based environment, you might not have dedicated hosts already assigned as such. So really we have to actually say that as the host come up, you actually have to assign components to it. So how do we make it such that in a blueprint you can actually make host discovery possible as such, and I will cover a little bit more in the next slide. And the second thing which was missing in the past, which we have actually made sure that we can do that, is basically we have something called a stack advisor, which can recommend and validate your configs before you make deployments itself. So now when you actually go ahead and deploy, actually it will actually invoke into the stack advisor and make recommendations based on that. So all this work has been happening in the past few months as such. So let's take an example of a blueprint deployment with host discovery. Here if you see, there are two host groups where I have a slave host group and a super slave host group, and what we are saying is that we are going to specify certain predicates that hey, any host which has more than one CPU assigned to the slave host group, and any host which is which has more than this much amount of memory, go ahead and actually assign to the super slave as such. So as the hosts come up, based on what is the configuration of the host, they will be assigned to the say correct category, and based on that basically the components will be installed on those hosts as such. So this is the dynamic discovery part of things. The next big thing is about Carburization. So if you actually have ever dealt with creating a secure cluster, a Hadoop cluster itself, you must have identified that it's really difficult to manually do this, and this actually is very important, especially in investment or banking areas where they want to really make sure that the data is secure. And Ambari has taken really big steps in this area where the whole Carburization of the cluster is automated. So overall, like it's completely a hands-free or like a wizard-based experience where you can actually specify these are the principles I want to use, these are the key types I want to use. It also works with the MIT KDC or Active Directory. We support both. And the other challenge is that once you have Carburized the cluster, you also want to make sure that if you add hosts or you add components, that they come up in a secure fashion as well. And all those scenarios have been covered when we say we support Carburized or secure clusters as such. So this was one dynamic of things where we want to make sure that we can deploy the cluster itself. But the other aspect of all this is how do we go about with releasing artifacts as such, and that's where we are actually bringing in something that we are terming it as management packs. So traditionally Ambari releases and the stack releases have been tied together, which means that every time you have a stack definition change, you have to go and release Ambari. Now if you actually really want multiple vendors to actually use, you actually want to make sure that all these are separate release trains, which means that the stacks need to be released as independent entities, and actually Ambari release should be just a Ambari core release which has the core functionality, does not know anything about stacks, and the stacks can actually be independent releases as such. So basically in a nutshell, we are decoupling stack releases from Ambari core releases as such. And the other aspect of things is that apart from what's there in the stack, there are a lot of use cases where people want to bring in add-on functionality using third-party services, where we want to go about with for example running Microsoft R or Hawk on top of HDP as just to give an example. And in the past we didn't really have a very we had a very rudimentary way of bringing in add-on services, but now we actually are focusing on add-on services using management packs as well, where management pack can be a release vehicle for add-on services, and the service itself can be self-contained, which means that it can actually specify how do I want to integrate into the stack itself. So all of these great improvements are actually happening under the hood. And as I mentioned, what we are doing here is separating out the release trains, where right now like Ambari and stack releases are kind of coupled together, because we actually have to make the stack release align with the Ambari release or vice versa. But now they can actually go on to their own own track, as well as the management packs. Like a stack release may or may not require a management pack change, and that's why like that's what it's depicting here, that these are all separate release trains, and this is what is the long-term goal that we want to achieve. So essentially, in a nutshell, management packs are generalized release artifacts in which you can actually bundle anything that you want, which are things which are, for example, stack definitions or add-on services or views and so on and so forth. And as I already mentioned, we are decoupling stack releases from Ambari core releases. These are essentially going to be tarballs, but it has metadata inside it which specify what is the applicability and what are the contents of the management pack. And you can view things as that a stack now would actually be an overlay of multiple management packs. For example, I can create a management pack for HDP stack itself, and say Microsoft R management pack and a Hawk management pack, and these can actually specify that, hey, version 1.0.0 of Microsoft R is applicable for HDP 2.3 onwards, and 2.0 version is applicable on to HDP 2.3.0 onwards as such. And this basically makes it much more flexible and makes these as independent entities as such. So overall, where we are is in our short-term goals are that in this release we are actually going to make a V0 version of the management pack, which retrofits into the current architecture itself, the stack processing framework as such, and it will help enable third parties to ship add-on services. The interface is a little rudimentary, where we have as a command line support, but the long term goals is to bring in something called as a management pack framework, which will replace the stack processing framework, and we will start delivering. Right now we are not focusing on making this as a release vehicle for views, but in the long term we are going to do that as well, and we will have REST APIs to support management packs as well. With this, I will switch over to Alejandro, who will walk you through the remaining topics as such. Thank you.
So earlier I talked about role-based access control and how it's essential for growing organizations. And so Ambari today already integrates with LDAP, and now there's a need for users to have very precise control over who can actually add services, who can Carburize the cluster, and this is because in the olden days it was usually just one person monitoring the entire cluster. Today that's no longer the case. You have a set of users that are really operators, you have administrators, and in addition, you have actual data scientists that only really need to look at the views. And so I briefly want to go over some of the RBAC terms. So the way it's implemented today, we now have roles that have permissions, we have users that belong to groups, those groups can also have permissions, and on top of that, users can also have additional privileges. And so the way it's structured is as follows. We have an admin that can do everything, a cluster administrator that can do everything except grant permissions, a cluster operator that's really there for the day-to-day activities, managing alerts, curb rows, upgrades, etc. You can also grant privileges to just individual services, so someone that is just managing Hive or just Spark, and adding either more components for those services, but they can't actually edit the cluster topology, such as adding more hosts. We also have a service operator. That's a reduced role in which they can only change configs. And last but not least, we have a read-only user. So this is a very exciting feature because it really means that Ambari is becoming more enterprise ready than it was before. The other really big feature for being enterprise ready is related to upgrades. And if you're familiar with the way it used to work over a year ago, it was a very manual approach. You had to do everything by hand, or in this case, using your feet. So upgrading the entire cluster took several days because you had to know exactly which configs to change. You had to upgrade the bits ahead of time. And on top of that, you had to have very precise knowledge about every component and actually incur downtime. So over a year ago, we came up with a feature called rolling upgrade. And what it does is it lays out the bits side by side ahead of time. And we essentially switch over to the new version, one component per host at a time. So for example, you would pick one host and upgrade data node, then node manager, then region server, and do that across all core slaves. So that's just for the core slaves, and you could also do the same thing for your masters and all of your clients. And so the way I like to think about this is similar to refueling a jet plane while it's still flying. It's very, very difficult. The recent approach that we added a couple of months ago is called express upgrade. And so it's much, much faster because you actually have to incur downtime, but it's equally reliable. And so in this model, we are batching 100 hosts at a time. So we upgrade the entire stack, service by service. We'll do all of the Zookeeper servers. We'll do all of the region servers, all of the node managers, and you keep moving up into the stack. Actually, upgrading your cluster is fairly easy now. And so there's only a couple of steps, and it's really only a couple of clicks away. Of course, if you're going to decide to do a rolling upgrade, you must meet a couple of prereqs, such as having name node HA, because the cluster must be up the entire time. And so Ambari has APIs, and it has a UI that shows whether your cluster meets all of the criteria, whether you want to do a rolling upgrade or an express upgrade. We also prompt the user to take backups of data. And in some cases, we do that for them already, such as taking backups of namespace. The user is also responsible for registering the new version and installing it side by side. And so the reason why we went with this approach is because you can save time. If you install the bits side by side, you could do this ahead of time and really only have downtime while the actual upgrade is going on, in which we are restarting components one at a time. The upgrade is actually very safe and robust, and so the orchestration performs several checks. So let's say after 30% of core slaves have been upgraded, you want to check that the cluster can still run jobs. And so we prompt you whether you want to continue. If for whatever reason you do encounter an error, you always have the option to either retry or downgrade in the worst case scenario. And there's also features that we've enabled for the cloud that will automatically retry upon failures, that are smarter about timeouts and such. And the last step is of course to finalize. And so at this point, we switch over to the new version and you can't go back. But in case you do want to go back, there's always a downgrade option at every single checkpoint. And so here's a quick example of how rolling upgrade is actually orchestrated. So we start with the low-level services, such as Zookeeper, and then we move our way up the stack. And so we'll do all of the core masters, all the core slaves. And so because of this orchestration order and the way it's actually meant to work with, say, HTTP stack, your cluster is up the entire time, and jobs are actually still running. So that's really the takeaway feature here. So you've now upgraded your cluster. What's the next thing you want to do to it? You actually want to monitor and analyze it and see whether you're getting the full potential of your stack. And so recently, we added a Grafana UI for Ambari metrics. And so what this allows you to do is have dashboards for every single service. And so I think for the starting services, we're adding HCFS, Yarn, HBase, and a couple of others. But what this allows you to do is have a drill down view of how your cluster is performing. Say you want to look at the aggregate memory of your cluster. You want to look at how CPU wait times are affecting one particular host. You can do queries that involve either max, min. You can select top and also change the order of metrics. And so I'll probably go over a demo in a couple minutes, but here's a quick view of what that looks like, in which I have a dashboard for my entire cluster of metrics. I've got one as well for HCFS, in which I can look at RPC calls. And so I'll do a quick demo. So this is now available in Ambari 2.2.2 and later. And so there are 15 dashboards right now. So everything, in this case, it's a much smaller cluster, but you can look at individual services, individual components, and actually drill down to see hosts. So let's go look at system. So in a couple of examples, we've actually had to use this for customers, and it's proven to be extremely useful. So there is one use case in which randomly a couple of yarn jobs would fail, and we had really no idea why. So the customer spent 2 to 3 weeks trying to figure out why and troubleshooting. At the end, it turned out that one particular host was having very high RPC wait times, and the only way we were able to find that out was by looking at this sort of dashboard. And so we've had similar experiences in which, let's say there was a flaky network card, and really we only identified that by going through a dashboard like this. So this is going to deploy automatically with AMS, and we really only recommend it for using it with AMS. And by default, there are 2 sets of users, an administrator and also an anonymous user, such as the one I'm using right now, which I'm not actually logged in. The other feature that we've added for troubleshooting is actually log search. So this came about a couple of months ago during a hackathon, and what we've done is integrate Solar, something similar to Logsites, but it's called Logfeeder, and a smart UI around it. So in this case, I'm actually reducing the number of logs I'm capturing to make it efficient, but I can actually look at logs for, say, just Hive or all of my services, and fine-tune whether I want, say, just info or error warning logs, etc. And so there's also an option to specify a time range. So this is aggregating logs across all of the services in my cluster. So if I look at yesterday and maybe Ambari logs, I see a couple of errors. So this is really making it really easy for cluster operators to quickly find out what's wrong with the cluster. They can also drill down to go to the actual logs themselves and see how it's spread over time. They can look at individual hosts and go to those logs. And so this is a very powerful feature. And so last but not least, yeah, thank you. So what do we think Ambari is headed to next? And what we've seen are several trends. The first is cloud features, just as Giush mentioned. We need to be faster and more reliable deploying in the cloud. There's a lot of scenarios in which either hosts have to come up, we have to either upgrade them by swapping VMs, and really make it easier to have all operations just be one click away. There's also a need for customers to move faster. So there's a lot of Spark talks going on even throughout the summit. And so what we've noticed is that customers want to run multiple versions of Spark in the same cluster. So how do you run, say, Spark 1.6 and 2.0 at the same time? How do you upgrade both? And so that's something that we're talking about already. And actually, Ambari 2.4 is using Spark as the first example. Things are a little bit hard-coded for now, but it does support both versions of Spark running simultaneously. And so this is really going to allow users to adopt stacks and move at a faster cadence. There's also the notion of yarn assemblies. And so there's been a lot of talks about apps running on Slider, and so these will become first-class citizens in Ambari. And lastly, there's a need to do component-level upgrades or patch-level upgrades. So what if in your cluster you just want to upgrade data nodes, or only patch a single jar across the entire cluster? Even though today we have rolling and express upgrade, these features take either downtime in the case of express upgrade, or they take a lot of preparation. You have to notify everyone in your organization. But if you're just patching a single jar, it's much, much easier to just deliver that across the entire cluster. And so I think that's where Ambari is going, and we're pretty excited to see it get in there as quickly as it can. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question on your rolling upgrade slide. If one of the components fails,
It does not. It prompts you to either retry or fix it manually, and that's usually what, or change configs. You can pause it and then go tweak things. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a massive alerting framework where you can monitor everything from, you can run scripts, you can do port checking, set intervals. It's very, very powerful, and also SMTP alerts. Sorry, can you repeat that?
The keywords you're talking about, the error, fatal, is it customizable or is it fixed?
So there's actually a regex file that specifies how to actually parse each log file. And so we can track, let's only capture, say, error and fatal for HBase. And so it's up to each component to actually tell us how to parse its logs and where those logs are stored at. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can grep, but you can definitely pick a time range, you can pick a component, and also filter on a host. Gentlemen.
Yeah, so actually on that front, there are such certain fields to include search or exclude search, where you can actually specify certain regex patterns where you can actually do some filtering. Yeah.
The gentleman.
Oh, sorry.
It does. There's a process that does an LDAP sync, and you can configure how often that runs. We do have that, yes. So the question is, can we secure individual views? Right? And the answer is yes. Do we have a
Docker version of the
Docker
HDP?
version of HCP?
Not yet. Let's leave it to that.
Okay.
When is log search? What version of Ambari is log search available?
I think we've had, don't quote me on this, but a beta already out, but this is already in Ambari 2.4, which is in trunk, and it's stabilizing as we speak.
Few more weeks.
It does install Solar, yes. Yeah.
Does Ambari have plans to add other products like NiFi or Solar?
To add add-on services? So we are providing the framework. We can definitely talk more about it, like about a specific use case. But as a framework, we are going to keep it generic. It's not just for services which we are going to create, but also for third party as such. So NiFi could be one of them if you really want to. But right now we are not planned for it.
Two questions. Part A, you support just HTTP stack of the core components or you support other stacks as well?
There are other stacks and other vendors, and so part of the management pack goal was to allow this much, much easier, because there's a lot of hard-coded things that existed before. That's no longer the case today.
And part B is the stack compatibility between different components is important, but I think for enterprise customers, the application that is running on it, that compatibility is important as well, because you find out, even though the components work with each other, the cluster is up and you run in production, and maybe a day later you find out some other application that ran doesn't work anymore because something has changed. So what are you guys thinking about application compatibility?
So if I understand you right, you're saying that there could be certain different versions of a service which you are running in different stacks as such, right? So this might actually go into more of ODPI discussion, where we basically if the stack is ODPI compliant, you can it's kind of a way of saying that we can actually make some guarantees that this would work for applications, but certain things which we may or may not be able to guarantee. So it's more of like what is to the specification and what is not to the specification. Sure. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, have you ever done a HA failover from your primary name node to standby node? Have you ever
So the name node HA wizard will actually go through those same steps of removing the secondary name node and adding a proper name node.
I never could get the wizard to work properly. It would always get confused between the primary name node and the standby name node. I would end up crashing the cluster. Have you ever
So-
done it yourself?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, a couple hundred times.
So if
Yes, using the wizard.
why don't you file a Jira and we'll take a look at the logs. Thanks.
All right, and one more question? That's a great question. So how do you manage multiple clusters? I believe Cloudbreak may have a view today that does some of that stuff, but we can definitely talk about that as a plan for Ambari to actually be natively built inside Ambari.
So on that front, one more thing is that really what we are trying to gauge is that do people want to have multiple instances of a service or they really want to have two separate clusters within the same Ambari instance. So it's on the roadmap to support multi-cluster as well, but we have to actually really look at first doing multi-instance and see if that addresses all the scenarios or there is really a value add to do multi-cluster as such.
Do you also support installing multiple instances of the same service, the same version? Like, for example, multiple people going
Yeah. So right now we don't support multi-instance. It's in the future roadmap. We are actually thinking about it, starting to look into it, but we are not there yet as such.
How soon are you going to add free IPA as an option for Carburization?
That's a good question. I don't know. If you make it zero, we can talk about it.
Well, okay. I think I'll talk to you later.
And then last question.
Do you have plans for automated service checks? Right now, there's just like port checking, but if a service is hung, it'll show that it's up, but there's no actual like background service checking that runs automatically.
That's a very good ask actually, because today it's on demand. You have to go run a service check, which is sometimes stricter than just a port check or some other type of PID check. And so we could try to actually do those periodically. That's actually a really good idea.
When you turn secure socket on for Ambari SSL, is that Grafana and log search going to be SSL as well?
Grafana does support SSL, yes.
In log search?
Log search, I don't know. My guess is yes. Yeah.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Related to that, I know that TLS 1.2 supports something that's not there right now. Is that you can turn TLS 1.2 on, limited to that, but the agents can't.
So it's a little bit harder here from up
Yeah.
here. Can you repeat that question?
So I'm just wondering if you were going to support TLS 1.2 in the near future.
Oh, TLS. So the Ambari properties file, you can actually add which ciphers are supported and which ones are excluded. You can actually do that already.
So the report from the field is that the limits, then the agents can't communicate with
Sounds like it's your.
try different communications. I believe there's even above.
Yeah, we can always talk offline about that. Yeah.
So you talked about role-based access and roles. So when you're running a wizard, if you log in a second time, the second string once you get logged in pops up the wizard too. If you decouple that,
So I believe because of the way the UI is built, if you open up another browser, it will go to the same place in the wizard.
it
But
will.
if it's a different user, there's a safeguard against it now. So it will
So y'all fix that. But what if I want to log in? I'm running the wizard as. the
Oh, I
user,
see. I see your question.
Right, and I log and so something, maybe I'm doing a roll and upgrade and something's not restarting properly. Then I want to log into and see what the status is with the same user ID. I'll get the daggone upgrade.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that decoupled with the role,
Um,
based access? Because that's if I go over here and click to clear the window, it could blow me up over here.
Correct. You may have to use a different browser.
Yeah,
And I
so
think we're out of
basically
time.
You want to stay on the same browser.
Yeah.
And if rolling upgrade pauses for because of the failure, then there's an option to say pause upgrade. then you can, you know, make config changes and do whatever you want.
Right, but if you're just doing, if you're adding a service, and you want to log in and manage your cluster while you're adding a service, that other login is going to get the add
Yeah.
service screen. That needs to be decoupled for these role-based.
That's correct, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you everyone again
Thanks
for your
a lot.
time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for your questions too. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thank you.